On the night of May 9th, 1995, 11-year-old Sarah Bennett folded her favorite blue t-shirt, kissed her mother goodnight, and fell asleep in a small beige house on Maple Avenue, Cedar Rapids, Iowa. By dawn, the kitchen light was still on, a plate of cinnamon cookies sat untouched, and the iron on the board was still warm. But Sarah and her babysitter, Megan Torres, were gone. Their quiet street awoke to sirens, disbelief, and a fear that would haunt Cedar Rapids for decades. For 25 years, the case froze in silence, until a single strand of DNA, sealed in an old evidence bag, broke the cold wide open. So what really happened inside that little house on Maple Avenue? And how far can time stretch before the truth finally speaks? Comment where you're watching from, your city, your state. And tell us if cases like this still linger where you live. Don't forget to subscribe, follow, and turn on the notification bell to keep these stories and their search for justice alive. On the evening of May 9th, 1995, Maple Avenue in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, seemed to belong to another world. A quiet world suspended somewhere between the last warmth of spring and the slow arrival of summer. Streetlights flickered gently over the rows of brick homes, painting pools of yellow light on the freshly swept sidewalks. Elm trees rustled overhead, their shadows dancing across the lawns where children's bicycles stood abandoned for the night. Inside the modest beige house at the very end of the avenue, Sarah Bennett, 11 years old, carefully folded her favorite blue t-shirt into a neat square. She sat cross-legged on the living room carpet, her small hands moving with practiced precision as she stacked her school clothes beside her. Sarah's mother, Lowa, was nearby, humming softly to herself as she sorted through hospital uniforms, the scent of fabric softener lingering in the air. Lowa's eyes, tired but kind, occasionally flicked to the wall clock above the mantel. Each tick marked another second closer to the start of her night shift at Mercy Hospital. In the kitchen, Megan Torres, Lowa's new roommate, stood at the stove baking a fresh batch of cinnamon cookies. Megan was different from anyone Sarah had ever known. Her laughter was loud and frequent, her dark hair always pulled back in a messy ponytail. She'd only moved in 3 weeks earlier, bringing with her a battered recipe book, a sense of humor that could cut through even the toughest days, and a silent ache from a recent divorce. Despite her own troubles, Megan had offered to stay with Sarah on the nights when Lowa was away. It was an arrangement born from necessity and trust, the kind neighbors sometimes make when the world feels a little too large and uncertain. The air inside the house was warm and sweet, filled with the smell of baking and the gentle rhythm of ordinary life. Outside, a soft rain began to fall, tapping against the window panes like the quiet footsteps of someone passing by. Lowa gathered her things, her nurse's badge, her thermos of coffee, a small umbrella already worn at the edges. She knelt to kiss Sarah's forehead, lingering a moment as if to imprint the feel of her daughter's hair, the faint trace of soap behind her ear. "Sleep tight, sweetheart. I'll be home before you wake up." Her voice was steady, but she glanced once at Megan before she slipped out the door, a silent request in her eyes. Take care of her. Sarah watched her mother leave, her heart fluttering between pride and worry. She knew how hard Lowa worked, how many sacrifices were hidden behind those tired eyes. Megan winked at her from the kitchen. "Almost done. You'll get the first cookie if you brush your teeth before the timer dings." It was the kind of bribe that never failed. Sarah giggled, rolling her eyes in mock exasperation as she hurried to the bathroom. The night settled in. Sarah lay on the couch, sketchbook open, listening to the comforting sounds of the house. The low hum of the refrigerator, the creak of old pipes, the gentle laughter as Megan cleaned up. Later, Megan joined her, and together they watched reruns on a flickering TV, the sound barely above a whisper. By 10:30, Sarah's eyelids grew heavy. Megan led her to bed, tucking the covers tight, leaving the hall light on just as Laura always did. "Good night, superstar," she whispered. Sarah barely heard her, already drifting into a dream of summer fields and open skies. Nothing seemed out of place. The clock ticked on. Outside, the rain stopped. Maple Avenue grew silent, the peaceful hush broken only by the distant bark of a neighbor's dog and the soft rush of wind through the trees. Yet, beneath this blanket of normalcy, something else moved. A shadow slipping between raindrops. A plan unfolding in the darkest corners of the night. In a few short hours, the world inside that little house would change forever. And the memory of this ordinary evening would haunt Maple Avenue for years to come. What really happened that night, behind closed doors and drawn curtains, would soon become the question echoing through every home in Cedar Rapids. Before that fateful night in May, the world of Sarah Bennett was a small one, marked by routines and the gentle rhythms of Midwestern life. Cedar Rapids in 1995 was a city still holding on to old habits, porch lights left on for neighbors, doors unlocked at bedtime, everyone greeting each other by name at the grocery store. Brick homes with low, sloping roofs stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the spreading arms of ancient elm trees. The city's heart beat steady, predictable, a place where secrets seemed impossible and dangers were things that happened elsewhere. For Sarah, this town was the only universe she had ever known. She was a quiet, observant child, more comfortable with a pencil than with words. In school, she drew pictures of animals and daydreamed her way through math lessons, always carrying a battered sketchbook that had become her constant companion. When she felt anxious, Sarah reached for her harmonica, a tiny silver one Laura had given her for her 9th birthday, and played soft, wobbly tunes in the living room, the notes floating up to the ceiling like fireflies in the dusk. Her brown hair often fell in front of her face as she drew, and her small fingers were always smudged with graphite. Laura Bennett, her mother, was the foundation of their home. At 38, Laura carried the burden of 2 jobs and a single parent's worries with a quiet grace. She was rarely still, always folding laundry or packing lunches, always moving between work and home. Yet beneath her strength was a constant fatigue, a bone-deep weariness that sometimes made her hands tremble as she poured her morning coffee. Despite this, she did her best to fill their lives with comfort and small joys. Movie nights on the old couch, pancakes for dinner, whispered bedtime stories about distant places they might visit someday. Everything changed when Megan Torres entered their lives. Megan was a co-worker of Laura's at Mercy Hospital, someone who understood the unspoken code of night shift nurses. Watch each other's backs, swap shifts when family emergencies happened, and share stories during bleary-eyed breaks. Megan had recently left her husband and was searching for a place to land, a way to rebuild. Moving in with Laura and Sarah was supposed to be temporary, a practical arrangement, nothing more. But within days, Megan's laughter and easygoing spirit softened the edges of the household. She cooked when Laura was too tired, played board games with Sarah, and insisted on baking at least once a week, filling the kitchen with the smell of sugar and cinnamon. The Bennett house itself sat at the far end of Maple Avenue, its beige siding faded by years of sun and winter wind. The backyard sloped gently down to a line of hedges, and the sliding glass door was notorious for sticking. Inside, the rooms were small but welcoming. Sunlight poured through the front windows in the afternoons, warming the living room where Sarah's drawings lined the fridge and Megan's recipe cards crowded the countertops. There was always a sense of movement, laundry tumbling in the dryer, music playing quietly from the radio, Laura's shoes by the door, ready for the next long shift. For all its simplicity, Cedar Rapids had its share of small dramas. Lost pets, neighborly disagreements, the occasional storm that knocked out the power for a night. Yet nothing truly bad ever seemed to last. The town held itself together with traditions, potlucks at the local church, softball games at the park, families gathering for Sunday dinners. Even as the world beyond Iowa's cornfields grew more complicated, Maple Avenue remained a place where children played past sunset and people waved from their porches, certain of their safety. No one could have predicted how quickly that certainty would shatter. In the weeks leading up to the night that would change everything, there were no warnings, no strangers lurking in shadows, no threats whispered over fences. The Bennetts, like everyone else, trusted in the ordinary goodness of their community. They believed that the locks on their doors were enough, that the rules of their little world would hold. They could not have known that sometimes danger is not a shadow outside, but a ripple within, a presence that slips quietly through the cracks, unseen and unstoppable. The story of Sarah, Laura, and Megan was never meant to end in tragedy. It began as so many stories do, with people simply trying to make a life, to build something safe and loving amid the uncertainties of the world. But fate had other plans for Maple Avenue, and as the hours crept toward midnight, the calm that had defined their days was about to be erased, leaving only questions and the echo of what once was. The night slipped away quietly on Maple Avenue, leaving behind only the muted hush of a world not yet awake. By the time Laura Bennett clocked out at Mercy Hospital, the first hints of morning were just beginning to soften the darkness. She drove home through streets shrouded in mist, headlights carving yellow tunnels in the thick air. The city slept as she passed, porches empty, curtains drawn, the gentle patter of rain already dried from the pavement. At home, Laura parked her car at the curb, stretching her sore neck as she glanced at the row of silent houses. The Bennett house sat in its usual peace, nothing outwardly disturbed. She fumbled for her keys, the routine familiar, comforting, a ritual that always marked her return from the long hours of fluorescent lights and beeping monitors. She reached the front door and tried the handle. It was locked, just as she'd left it. A small note of reassurance. But something felt different as she stepped around to the back. The grass was wet, soaking through her sneakers. There, the sliding glass door stood open, its white curtains stirring restlessly in the cool breeze. Laura's heart skipped. The door had always been temperamental, but she was sure Megan would have checked it, would have made certain it was secure before bed. Inside, the kitchen lights blazed, throwing stark shadows across the countertops. The warm, sweet smell of cinnamon cookies lingered in the air, but now it seemed strange, an echo from another, happier hour. Half a plate of cookies waited untouched beside a mug of tea, the steam long gone. Dishes sat in the sink. The iron on the board was still warm, a forgotten shirt slung over the edge, as if someone had been interrupted in the middle of folding. Laura set her bag down, nerves prickling as she listened for sounds, footsteps, voices, the familiar creak of floorboards. Nothing. Only the hum of the refrigerator and the distant, steady drip of water. "Sarah? Megan?" she called softly, her voice swallowed by the silence. She walked slowly through the kitchen and down the hallway, every step heavy with dread. The house felt too still, the air thick and unmoving. In the bathroom, a towel was bunched on the floor, the faucet dripping, leaving a growing puddle on the tiles. Laura's eyes scanned for any sign of movement, some evidence of life. Nothing. At the end of the hall, she pushed open Sarah's bedroom door. In the half-light, the room looked strangely untouched. Stuffed animals lined up on the bed, the sketchbook open to a half-finished drawing. But something was wrong. An unnatural stillness, a sense that time had paused in the instant before disaster. There on the bed, two bodies lay side by side. The sheets were rumpled, as if in restless sleep, but the positions were too rigid, the air too cold. Pillows pressed over their faces, their small forms eerily quiet. Laura could not move, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes saw. For a long moment she stood frozen, unable to speak or scream. It was the slow drip from the bathroom that finally snapped her back. The sharp, insistent reminder that the world was still turning, indifferent to her horror. She staggered backward, hand trembling as she reached for the phone. In the haze of shock, her memories blurred. Shouts, sirens, neighbors spilling onto lawns in robes and slippers, police cars filling the quiet street, blue lights flashing against the walls that had once promised safety. Investigators would later note the details. No broken glass, no overturned furniture, nothing to suggest a struggle. The only clues were those quiet signs, the iron left on, the plate of cookies, the sliding door breathing in the morning air. Whatever had happened in that house had come and gone with the silence of a nightmare, leaving no answers, only loss. By sunrise, the normal rhythms of Maple Avenue had been shattered. The Bennett's world, once built on rituals and quiet joys, had been erased, replaced by grief and the aching, unanswerable question that would haunt Laura and the town for years to come. By the time the sky turned pale with the first hints of morning, Maple Avenue had become unrecognizable, where there was once only the gentle hum of a sleepy street. Now there pulsed an electric tension, sirens echoing down the block, red and blue lights flashing against the dawn. News vans rolled up. Reporters hunched over microphones as neighbors stared, wide-eyed and silent, from behind half-drawn curtains. Cedar Rapids was a city that had always prided itself on safety. Now, its confidence had been shattered overnight. As word spread, 2 lives lost, an 11-year-old girl and her babysitter found murdered in their own home. Shock settled over the town like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The Gazette was quick to deliver the news, the headline in thick, black type: "The Maple Avenue Murders." The name stuck instantly, whispered in every corner store, murmured through classrooms, prayed over in Sunday services. No one could make sense of it. At the Bennett house, uniformed officers and crime scene investigators moved through the rooms, careful, methodical, their faces hard and unreadable. Yellow tape fluttered in the breeze, cordoning off the porch where only a night ago Laura had kissed her daughter goodbye. Now, it was a stage for tragedy. The scent of cinnamon cookies clung to the air, a cruel reminder of how ordinary everything had seemed before. Laura was not herself, not really anyone at all, just a shell, hollowed by disbelief. She sat on the front steps as neighbors gathered in silent clusters, hands folded, voices hushed. Someone had placed a single teddy bear beside her, and soon it was joined by others, stuffed animals, candles, flowers piling up in a growing shrine to the lost. A neighbor from 2 doors down pressed a mug of tea into Laura's hands, but it only trembled, untouched, in her lap. She was far away, trapped in the last moment she'd seen Sarah alive, her mind replaying her daughter's small, hopeful smile, Megan's gentle wave from the kitchen. Whispers moved through the crowd. Parents clutched their own children tighter. Friends exchanged looks, heavy with fear. If it could happen here, in this house, on this street, then nowhere was truly safe. Maple Avenue, once just another quiet road, had become a symbol of something broken. Inside the house, evidence was catalogued, photographs snapped, questions asked and answered until everything blurred together. The television crews waited at the curb, hoping for a statement, a glimpse of the grief that had overtaken this little corner of the world. But there were no words, nothing that could reach the depth of Laura's pain, or the confusion that spread like wildfire through the city. Laura's voice, when it finally came, was barely more than a whisper, lost among the footsteps and radio crackle of the investigators. She hated sleeping alone. I should have stayed home. Regret weighed every syllable down, and there was nothing anyone could say to ease it. Megan's friends arrived in tears, remembering the warmth of her laughter, her endless optimism even when her own world had been falling apart. As the day wore on, the shock transformed. It grew into something sharper, more enduring, a fear that wormed its way into every conversation, a grief that would not let go. Parents changed their routines, double-checked the locks they had never bothered with before. Neighbors kept their lights on, even in broad daylight. At the Bennett house, time seemed to splinter. The porch, covered in candles and toys, became a place of vigil. People left notes, flowers, silent prayers written on scraps of paper, hoping somehow the act would make sense of the senseless. For Laura, each hour stretched endlessly. Sleep would not come, nor would comfort. The ache was too deep, the questions too loud. How could life have been so normal only yesterday? How had safety become an illusion? Cedar Rapids, once a city of trust and neighborly warmth, found itself changed by the shadows of a single night. Caught between the memory of peace and the new, raw edges of fear and heartbreak. In the days that followed, the house on Maple Avenue became less a home than a sealed-off crime scene, cordoned by yellow tape that fluttered in every breeze like a warning no one in Cedar Rapids could ignore. Inside, the routines of daily life had been replaced by the methodical, almost clinical movements of detectives and forensic teams. What had once been a kitchen filled with warmth and the scent of cinnamon was now a place of cold scrutiny. Counters dusted for fingerprints, every drawer and closet examined, each innocent object weighed for the secrets it might hold. Detective Miller led the investigation with a quiet intensity. He was young, but his eyes were already old, shaped by too many scenes like this one. He and his team combed through the Bennett home, every detail entered in their notebooks, the single white sock left under the coffee table, the trail of wet footprints leading from the sliding glass door, a small ring of unfamiliar keys lying forgotten on the kitchen floor. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken glass, no jimmied locks. Whoever had come into the house that night had done so quietly, with knowledge and intent. Someone who knew the way the back door stuck, who knew how to move without waking a sleeping child. Neighbors were questioned, their faces tense and anxious as they tried to remember every car that had driven by, every unusual sound in the night. Friends and co-workers of Laura and Megan were called in, their connections mapped out on a whiteboard in the makeshift police command center. The questions spread in every direction. Who would do this? Why? Was it random, or something far more personal? One name soon rose to the surface: Daniel Holt, a 45-year-old electrician with a history in the neighborhood. He had fixed the Bennett's sliding door only weeks before, had even chatted with Megan as she handed him a glass of lemonade. Holt lived alone, a few streets over, and when detectives knocked on his door, he answered with visible surprise, claiming he'd spent the night at home, watching television. There was no one to verify his alibi, no neighbor who had seen his lights on or his car in the driveway. Holt agreed to answer questions, his demeanor calm but detached, his eyes giving nothing away. Back at the lab, evidence piled up, samples swabbed from pillowcases and doorknobs, strands of hair collected from the carpet, the mysterious keys bagged and labeled. In 1995, DNA testing was still a slow and uncertain science. The technicians did what they could, storing and cataloging every sample, knowing it might be years before real answers emerged. Still, hope clung to the belief that something in the evidence would crack the case open. But each interview, each late-night phone call led only to more questions, more frustration. As summer crept over Cedar Rapids, the investigation lost momentum. Weeks turned to months. Tips dried up. Daniel Holt faded back into the shadows of his own life, neither cleared nor charged, existing in that uneasy space reserved for those who are not quite innocent, yet not provably guilty. Laura returned to work, her movements haunted and mechanical, while neighbors learned to live with the sense of vulnerability that now lingered in every shadow and every half-closed door. In the Bennett house, life stood still. The small ring of keys, the white sock, the footprints, each became tokens of a mystery that stubbornly refused to be solved. For Detective Miller, the case file remained on his desk, its pages worn and smudged with hope and regret. The Maple Avenue murders soon slipped from the front page, and Cedar Rapids, still wounded, tried to move forward, pretending that some wounds could heal with time. But for those closest to the loss, the investigation's end brought no peace. Only the bitter taste of unfinished business and the knowledge that sometimes the most dangerous thing is not what lurks in the darkness, but what is left unknown. The days grew shorter, then stretched again into long, hot Iowa summers, and still the little beige house at the end of Maple Avenue stood silent. Where laughter and music once lived, there were now only boarded windows, the faint rattle of loose siding in the wind, and grass that grew taller than a child's waist. Time did its best to soften the memory of tragedy, but the wounds in Cedar Rapids only faded at the surface. Underneath, they throbbed with every mention of Sarah Bennett and Megan Torres. Neighbors walked a little quicker past the house, eyes fixed on the sidewalk, uncomfortable with the reminder of all they'd lost. For some, it became a story to warn their children. The silent house, they called it now, as if giving it a name would make its ghosts less real. Children dared each other to touch the porch steps on Halloween, but none lingered after dark. Life went on, or pretended to. New families moved in up and down the street, planting flowers and stringing lights, determined to restore some sense of normalcy. But no one ever rented the Bennett house, its mail slot filled with flyers and dust. Detective Miller, who had been a rookie back then, kept the case file on the edge of his desk for years, long after the others had moved on to newer, solvable cases. Each page was marked by fingerprints, coffee rings, and the ache of unsolved questions. Occasionally, he'd drive by Maple Avenue, pausing in front of the boarded windows. He could never quite let it go, not just because of the brutality, but because of the quiet ache in Laura Bennett's eyes, her faith that someone someday would tell her what happened to her daughter. Every May 10th, Laura returned to the police station with the same worn photograph. Sarah, in a blue dress, her eyes bright and hopeful. Laura's hair turned grayer each year, her shoulders a little more stooped. She asked the same question. "Any news?" And every year, Miller had to look her in the eye and tell her the truth. There was nothing. Not a single new lead, not one answer that made sense. 1998 passed, then 2007 and 2014, each year leaving a deeper groove of sorrow and determination in Laura's heart. Sarah's bedroom remained untouched, a small shrine to the life she had lived, a harmonica on the nightstand, sketches pinned crookedly to the walls, a stuffed rabbit perched at the foot of the bed. Laura dusted the room regularly, careful to keep everything exactly as it had been. On birthdays and anniversaries, she lit a candle, her silent vigil against the darkness that had stolen her child. Megan's friends remembered her in quieter ways, a recipe shared at a potluck, a song played on the radio. They gathered sometimes, retelling the same old stories, but there was always a moment where conversation faltered, where the ache of absence filled the room. For Cedar Rapids, the case became a legend, folded into the fabric of local lore. The unsolved murders of Maple Avenue were discussed in whispers at backyard barbecues, on cold winter nights when the wind howled, and when something, anything, strange happened in town. Some speculated about Daniel Holt, the electrician whose name had once been everywhere and now belonged to the shadows. Others spun theories of strangers, of chance, but most, quietly, simply mourned. Officially, the case of Sarah Bennett joined Iowa's growing list of cold cases, a file number on a shelf among too many others. Unofficially, it never went cold for Laura, for Detective Miller, or for the neighbors whose sense of safety had been forever altered. Time marched on, relentless and indifferent, but some questions echoed louder with every passing year. There are houses that hold the living, and houses that hold memories. The little beige house at the end of Maple Avenue became the latter, a silent witness, waiting for someone to listen, for a day when the truth might finally break through the silence and bring the past to light. A quarter-century passed, and with each year, the story of the Bennett house faded a little more from the headlines, replaced by new tragedies, new scandals, new faces in Cedar Rapids. Yet for those who remembered, the ache never dulled. Laura Bennett had become a familiar presence at the police station every spring, her faith tested but unbroken. Detective Miller, his hair now peppered with gray, still carried the Maple Avenue file with him, a silent promise he refused to break. Then, late in November 2019, something changed. It began with an ordinary arrest. Daniel Holt, the once suspected electrician, picked up by local police after a late-night altercation with a neighbor. A scuffle over property lines, a flurry of angry words and flailing fists. Routine, almost forgettable, except that in 2019, every arrest brought with it a new requirement. A DNA swab entered into the national database, CODIS. No one thought much of it at first. Holt's name hadn't crossed the desks at the Cedar Rapids PD in years. The Maple Avenue murders were a ghost story by then, a cautionary tale more than an active case. The evidence collected in 1995 had been boxed, sealed, and shelved. The hope of justice filed away with it. But within weeks of Holt's DNA entering the system, Detective Miller's phone rang, shattering the silence. The lab's voice on the other end was crisp, factual, almost cold. There was a match. DNA found on the pillowcase where Sarah Bennett had slept, sealed and stored for decades, now matched Daniel Holt beyond a shadow of a doubt. Miller sat frozen in his chair, disbelief warring with a surge of old, battered hope. He opened the file for the 1000th time, flipping through faded photos and evidence reports, rereading the notes he'd once memorized. Could it be that simple? That after all the years, all the pain, the answer had been there, quietly waiting for science to catch up? Cedar Rapids was stunned as news broke. The case that had haunted the town, that had nearly broken Lowa, was alive again. Reporters returned to Maple Avenue, their cameras and notepads stirring old fears, old questions. People who'd long since moved away called friends for updates, the whole city holding its breath. When confronted with the results, Daniel Holt was strangely calm. "I used to know Lowa," he said, his voice measured, almost bored. "Maybe my DNA was just left there." It was the kind of explanation that might have passed in another era. But the science was clear. The DNA found was fresh that night, not some artifact of past friendship or a forgotten visit. The pillowcase, the spot where a child's head had once rested, held the answer that no one could deny. Detectives gathered new statements, piecing together the fragments of Holt's life. His past visits to the Bennett house, his failed alibis, the way he had slipped out of focus as suspicion waned. The details felt sharper now, each one a clue missed, a red flag ignored. For Lowa, the call from Detective Miller was both a shock and a lifeline. Her grief, which had worn so many faces over the years, twisted again, now laced with anger, relief, and a bitter question. Why had it taken so long? As the city buzzed with rumors and reporters circled once more, Lowa found herself returning to Maple Avenue, standing in front of the house she'd lost. Grass still grew wild in the yard. The windows were still dark. But for the first time in decades, she felt something shift, a weight easing from her chest, the promise that after so many years, maybe the truth would finally come to light. Yet even as the evidence mounted, doubts lingered. 25 years of silence had left room for questions, and the path to justice would not be easy. Cedar Rapids braced itself for a reckoning, unsure what the final chapter of the Maple Avenue murders would hold. The wheels of justice turned slowly. But in March 2021, Cedar Rapids found itself once again at the center of a storm. The trial of Daniel Holt drew crowds to the courthouse, people gathering on the steps, peering through windows, hungry for answers after so many years of silence. Reporters with notepads in hand replayed the old story for a new audience, describing a case that had shaped the fears of a generation. For Lowa Bennett, every day was a balancing act, reliving her loss in public, holding on to the hope that finally someone would be held accountable. Inside the courtroom, time felt strangely suspended. The same evidence that had once lived in cardboard boxes now reappeared beneath harsh fluorescent lights. Photographs faded by age, the pillowcase that had carried the crucial DNA, testimony from forensics experts who explained in patient detail how technology had finally outpaced the shadows. Daniel Holt sat at the defense table, his expression blank, hands folded in front of him. He hardly reacted as the prosecutor listed the charges: 2 counts of first-degree murder, the full weight of the law closing in after a lifetime of suspicion. Laura sat behind the prosecutor's table, Sarah's photograph pressed between her palms. Megan's family filled the next row, their eyes never leaving the man accused of destroying their world. The courtroom air was thick with anticipation, fear, and the strange relief that justice might finally be within reach. The trial moved quickly. 3 days of forensic testimony, autopsy reports, and emotional recollections. Laura took the stand, her voice trembling as she described that ordinary night in May. The smell of cookies, the promise to return home before morning. She recounted the moment her life changed forever, the years of waiting, the cruel ache of not knowing. The jurors listened closely, some dabbing at their eyes, others stealing glances at the defendant. For many, it was hard to reconcile the quiet man in the suit with the horror described in the witness box. When the verdict came, it arrived like a thunderclap, guilty on both counts. The judge's words were steady, each sentence falling with finality. Daniel Holt showed no emotion as the sentence was read. The death penalty, the ultimate punishment for a crime that had haunted Cedar Rapids for decades. Outside, the news spread instantly. Strangers hugged Laura on the courthouse steps. Candles were lit once more on Maple Avenue, and a community long fractured by fear came together in cautious celebration. Yet, as quickly as the door to justice had opened, it threatened to close again. 6 months after the verdict, Holt's attorney filed an appeal, arguing that the evidence, sealed away for decades, could have been contaminated, that the passage of time had blurred the line between certainty and doubt. The legal process, so final just months before, became tangled in new questions. Reporters returned to Laura's doorstep, notebooks open, voices gentle but relentless. Was the DNA conclusive? Had the right man been convicted? Did the city truly believe justice had been served? Or was it simply desperate for closure after so many years? In quiet moments, Laura wrestled with the same doubts. Her faith in the system, once so strong, now flickered in the shadows of what-ifs and maybes. She watched the appeals process drag on, another season turning, another birthday missed, and wondered if the truth was destined to slip through her fingers yet again. The town of Cedar Rapids waited alongside her, caught in the uneasy space between relief and uncertainty. The Maple Avenue house still stood, silent and watchful, a monument to loss and resilience. For every answer the trial had brought, new questions took root, reminding everyone that time can never fully heal a wound left open too long. Justice, it seemed, was a promise as fragile as memory, a hope that demanded both patience and courage, and the willingness to face the darkness even when the outcome was never guaranteed. Long after the trial ended and the courthouse lights dimmed, the story of Sarah Bennett and Megan Torres continued to reverberate through Cedar Rapids. It became more than a local tragedy. It joined the tapestry of true crime stories that haunted small towns and big cities alike, where ordinary people are thrust into unimaginable nightmares and entire communities are left searching for meaning. As Laura sifted through old letters, photographs, and newspaper clippings, she sometimes found herself staring at a single sentence in a dusty file. Based on a true case. She had always thought her own grief was unique, but with every news report and crime show she saw, Laura realized that the pain of losing a child, the agony of unanswered questions, was a burden she shared with strangers across the country. One story in particular lingered in her mind, surfacing on sleepless nights when the wind howled against the boarded windows of the old house. It was the case of Robin Cornell and Lisa Story, 2 lives taken in Cape Coral, Florida, 5 years before Sarah's own world unraveled. The details were eerily familiar. An 11-year-old girl, her babysitter, a home that should have been safe but became the site of a brutal, senseless crime. For decades, their families waited for answers, living through the same endless cycles of hope and disappointment, leads that went nowhere, evidence that seemed just out of reach. Just like Sarah and Megan's case, Robin and Lisa's murder haunted not only their loved ones, but also the investigators, the neighbors, even the strangers who followed the case from afar. Over the years, stories were told and retold, rumors of suspects, theories that never panned out, moments when the world seemed ready to move on, and moments when the pain returned as sharp as ever. Every detail became a piece of a puzzle that would not fit, a reminder of justice delayed and the passage of time. But in Cape Coral, as in Cedar Rapids, technology finally caught up with the past. After 33 years of waiting, advances in DNA analysis identified Joseph Zieler as the killer. The courtroom in Florida echoed with the same mix of relief and sorrow, the knowledge that answers could bring comfort, but never restore what was lost. Zieler was sentenced to death in 2023, an ending of sorts, but not a true resolution for those whose lives had been shattered. Laura watched the news coverage with tears in her eyes, recognizing herself in the faces of Robin and Lisa's families. She understood the strange relief that came with justice, the complicated emotions that lingered even after a verdict was delivered. The bond she felt with those strangers was forged by shared suffering, by the knowledge that grief does not fade when the headlines disappear. It endures in every birthday missed, every empty seat at the dinner table, every memory that refuses to settle. Cedar Rapids carried its own ghosts, even as the rest of the world moved on. The Bennett house remained boarded and silent, but sometimes, on quiet evenings, neighbors claimed to see a light flicker in Sarah's old bedroom, or hear the faint notes of a harmonica drifting on the wind. Whether it was imagination or something more, those who loved Sarah and Megan held on to their memories as tightly as ever. The story was no longer just a collection of facts and evidence, of police reports and trial transcripts. It had become a testament to endurance, a reminder that behind every headline and every statistic are real lives, real families, and a legacy of love and loss that cannot be erased. For Laura, the story of Maple Avenue would always be more than a true crime. It was a lesson in hope, resilience, and the hard, necessary work of keeping memory alive, no matter how many years passed or how many questions remained unanswered. As the years quietly marched onward, the memory of Sarah Bennett and Megan Torres settled into the fabric of Cedar Rapids, woven into whispered prayers, family stories, and the silent rituals of grief and remembrance. The little house on Maple Avenue, once alive with music and laughter, became a landmark not of fear but of memory. Its windows, though dusty and shuttered, stood as silent sentinels, reminding passers-by of the fragility of peace and the cost of unanswered questions. On certain nights, Laura Bennett would sit at her kitchen table, her new apartment now, a smaller, quieter place, and light a candle beneath Sarah's favorite drawing, a sun rising over a field of wildflowers, sketched in the careful, hopeful hand of a child. She would remember Megan's kindness, the warmth of their home, and the night that had changed everything. These moments, raw and private, were her way of holding the past close, refusing to let Sarah and Megan become just another headline, another cautionary tale lost to time. But remembrance was not only private. Every May, The people of Cedar Rapids would gather on Maple Avenue, neighbors and friends and strangers alike. They would lay flowers on the steps, light candles at dusk, and stand in a circle, sharing stories not just of loss, but of love. The way Sarah had played her harmonica by the open window, the way Megan made the world brighter with laughter and fresh-baked cookies. The ceremony was never long, nor did it try to explain the inexplicable. It was simply a way for a wounded community to come together, to promise that even as life moved forward, the memory of the lost would not be left behind. In these moments, Laura sometimes spoke softly to the crowd, her voice steady with a resolve shaped by years of sorrow and survival. She urged them not to let vigilance slip, to trust their instincts, to look out for one another in ways both small and profound. She knew too well that violence could shatter even the safest places, that evil sometimes wore a familiar face. But she also believed in the healing power of truth, of persistence, community, and the fierce dignity that comes from refusing to forget. Over time, Sarah and Megan's story inspired others. Parents grew more watchful. Neighbors reached out. Children learned to speak up when something felt wrong. A few, moved by Laura's courage, volunteered for local organizations, helping families of missing or murdered loved ones, campaigning for better resources, pressing for justice in other cold cases. The lesson was clear. While violence could steal lives, it could not destroy memory, nor the hope that comes from searching for answers. As for Detective Miller, now retired, he kept the Bennett case file on a shelf in his home office, its edges soft with age. Sometimes he would open it, tracing the names and photographs, the reports and notes that had consumed so much of his career. The story, he knew, was not just about a crime solved or a verdict delivered. It was about dignity restored, about giving a voice to the voiceless, light to the shadows, and peace to a family who had lost so much. To this day, the wounds left by that night have not fully healed. Some never will. Yet, in the courage of those left behind, there is a lesson that outlasts the darkness. That truth, though slow, can mend what was broken. That remembrance is its own kind of justice, and that every life, no matter how brief, deserves to be honored. Tonight, as the candles flicker on Maple Avenue and the last notes of Sarah's harmonica seem to echo in the quiet, the story endures. It endures in every act of kindness, every vigilant neighbor, every voice raised to demand justice, and every heart that remembers. And so, if you believe that justice is worth fighting for, if you carry hope for a world where every family finds answers, share this story. Keep the memories of the lost alive, because some wounds can only be healed by truth, and some stories do not end until that truth is finally spoken.